Let's talk a bit more about how these insurgencies first emerged though. In response to the rampant inequality, particularly regarding the aforementioned land inequalities that had not been sufficiently addressed, certain leftist factions began to radicalise throughout the 1960s. From here, several guerrilla groups would emerge. These groups would often seize control of rural areas, of which they would govern through violence and lawlessness. They were often, though not always, inspired by Marxist ideologies from the current ongoing Cold War and the Cuban Revolution, aiming to overthrow capitalism in favour of socialism or communism. In many cases, they even received training and weapons from socialist countries such as Cuba. The three largest insurgencies throughout the 60s were the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, or FARC, the Popular Liberation Army, EPL, and the National Liberation Army, ELN. The ELN, for starters, would be founded in 1964 by a group of radicalised students and intellectuals who drew from not only Marxism, but a sweeping movement of liberation theology, which I'll explain more later. Essentially though, they viewed armed resistance as a moral obligation. The EPL, meanwhile, founded in 1967, were an offshoot of the splinter Communist Party, the PCC. They were inspired by the Chinese Cultural Revolution, advocating for Maoism as a revolutionary path for Latin America. Finally, there were the FARC, who before their status as a guerrilla insurgency, would start as a group of leftist peasants. Disillusioned by the violence and neglect they'd experienced during La Violencia, they were motivated primarily by agrarian reform, peasant rights, and resistance against government negligence. To serve their cause, they take over a region in the Tolima Mountains known as Marquetalia, the first of many areas where they'd operate under illegal autonomy from national authority. When the Colombian government subsequently launched a military campaign in the region in order to eliminate illegal self-defense groups in 1964, the results were dire. Instead of destroying the peasants, the operation would only further their contempt and radicalization, thereby leading to the formation of their guerrilla insurgency, the FARC. Similar to the ELN, the FARC were also influenced by Marxist philosophy and socialism, but following their origins as rural peasants, were more directly driven by issues of land reform and rural inequality. Prior to this fallout, Colombia returned to the US for military support in order to address a rise in broader guerrilla violence. Appealing to Castro's recent takeover of Cuba, it was hardly a challenge to stress the severity of the communist uprising in the regions of Washington, who go on to support Colombia through military training, intelligence, and equipment. Military support was only one side of the US's strategy for combating communism in Latin America, however. JFK was in favour of what he called a two-track policy. Counterinsurgency made up one of these tracks, but the other was a less direct and more diplomatic approach in the form of an initiative known as the Alliance for Progress. Launched in 1961, the initiative proposed to foster social reform through economic aid in order to reduce poverty and inequality and increase economic growth and education across Latin America. The ultimate motivation, however, was that social reform would help curb the spread of communism in the region. In Colombia alone, the US committed to the initiative by providing the country with hundreds of millions of dollars over a 10-year period. This alliance was greatly championed by President Camargo at the time, who believed that Latin America risked becoming a historical disaster without significant aid. Much to his delight, Colombia would become one of the first recipients of the alliance's funding in the entirety of Latin America. Unfortunately, however, the initiative was largely unsuccessful. Despite initially having a mild impact in certain areas such as literacy and healthcare, it ultimately succumbed to many significant obstacles such as political resistance, corruption, and a mismanagement of fund distribution. One of its key initiatives, land redistribution programs, meanwhile, would be fiercely opposed by elite landowners. These collective shortcomings would eventually lead to the alliance's demise by the 1970s. The alliance certainly was no substitute for militant counterinsurgency, however, and on this front the US would go all in via another initiative in 1962 known as Plan Lazo. The plan involved further increasing military aid such as training programs. It was also under Plan Lazo that Colombian forces launched Operation Sovereignty, the very operation that targeted the aforementioned rural peasants in Marquetalia, thereby leading to the formation of the FARC. Another significant measure from the Colombian military, meanwhile, would involve arming and deploying Colombian civilians in their operations. Through community outreach, the military, under US influence, would aim to win the hearts and minds of rural populations so they would feel compelled to join the fight. Initially meant as a temporary strategy, this practice would later become institutionalized in 1968 under President Lleras Restrepo. This was hugely significant, as it would later give way, at least in part, to a rise of paramilitary groups. These groups consisted of both regular citizens affected by the conflict in rural areas, along with representatives of business elites and wealthy landowners who were often the target of extortion and land seizures from guerrilla groups as described earlier. Like the guerrilla groups, however, the paramilitary would also soon become notorious for human rights abuses. They were known to target not only the guerrilla groups themselves, but also activists, students, and rural communities who were suspected of sympathising with the ideologies of the insurgencies. Among many of their shared tactics was the seizing of control over rural villages, with many citizens being forced into displacement due to the dire consequences if they didn't align themselves with these groups. By the late 1960s, the US's counterinsurgency efforts had become well established for the country. Hundreds of Colombian officers were trained in elite US military bases, such as Fort Gulick in Panama, where they would learn the most effective techniques for assassination, torture, bomb construction, and interrogation. These trainings would often be carried out by CIA operatives and US Army Special Forces, who then utilized these efforts to expand intelligence sharing networks and regional surveillance. This methodology would later find itself implemented in other countries with Cold War conflicts across Latin America too, such as Chile, El Salvador, and Guatemala. Amidst all this, the aforementioned National Front Agreement, which was scheduled to end in 1974, would receive some terms of discontinuation in a 1968 reform. Perhaps most notably, this reform would remove the policy of preset presidential alternation between the two major parties, along with the 50-50 party parity in public office. Despite these significant changes to governmental structure, however, guerrilla resistance would continue for decades to come.